Well, so some of you may have others. I'd like to turn it over to you. Raise your hand. I've been driving with questions so far, but I'd like to give you guys an opportunity to make some comments. You have a forum. Andy?
Andy's always good for a comment.
I think what makes this such a wonderful occasion to be able to pay tribute yet again to Doug and his spectacular team is that this vision hasn't really been realized in today's environment. We're looking back at this with a sense of nostalgia and wonder at what these magicians were able to do at the time. But you ask yourself, what have we got today? And I will say, a little bit cynically, always cynic in the sense of the Oscar Wilde sense of frustrated idealist, that we have a collection of tools at our disposal, but they don't interoperate. We've got Microsoft Word, and we've got PowerPoint, and we've got Illustrator, and we've got Photoshop. So we can do a lot of the individual things that were done in this system better because there's more functionality, and for my taste, it has an easier to understand user interface. But they don't work together. They don't play nice together. And most of the time, what you've got is an import-export capability based on bitmaps, the lowest common denominator, dead bits, in effect. And they had live bits. Everything interoperated. You were immersed in this super rich environment. And if you listen to the narration carefully, it's about authoring, it's about modifying, it's about studying, being really analytical and reflective about what it is you're doing. It's about communicating, collaborating, and then bootstrapping this whole process in the lovely recursive way that Doug already articulated in his earliest writings. We've lost that. So we have far better search in many ways. We have universal access because of the internet and the web. And that is a fantastic gain over the closed systems that were represented by NLS and the work we did at Brown over many decades and systems that other people built. So we lost some and we gained some. And what I'm, as the cynic, still looking for is a reintegration of these various components so that we can go back to the future and have this totality of the broad vision at our fingertips. And I don't see how we're going to get there, frankly, because commercial organizations that produce our software to a large extent aren't built that way. They build products, and products are built by teams, and the product often reflects the organizational structure of the team and the company. So you can say, well, what about mashups and Web 2.0 and do it yourself? Yeah, it's a wonderful bottom-up grassroots kind of way to grow software. But personally, being old-fashioned and old, I think the architecture that was defined by these wizards, and the head wizard especially, Doug, beats any amount of bottom-up sort of tinkering and mashing things together. And it's that lack of principled architecture that I really regret at this point.
I just wanted to say one other thing about, it's easy to look back 40 years and say, God, this is fantastic stuff. These guys are brilliant. This is fabulous. At the time, I think one of the things that Doug really gets credit for is persisting in spite of the fact that 90% of the people thought he was a crackpot. That this was a waste of time, wasn't going anywhere. The really good stuff was artificial intelligence, that other stuff over there. This was, who's going to ever use that kind of stuff? It's hard to believe now, of course, but at the time, we talked about the trouble of us understanding what Doug was saying some of the times. Think about everybody else out there in the world. There were a few people, I mean, we'll be getting Bob Taylor on here in a little while, a few people like that who sort of picked up on it. it's fed out into Xerox PARC and out into Apple and various places to take over the world. But at the time, Doug was a voice crying in the wilderness a lot of the time.
Let me tell you an anecdote about that to illustrate it. I was invited to a ARPA contractors meeting, and I can't remember whether it was 71 or 72. And Doug and the projector were schlepped there, and they did the whole thing for about an hour and a half, and it was awesome, just like what you saw today, except totally live for the most part. And I thought it was just stunning, even though I'd seen it before. And there was this pause, and then one of the brightest of them all, somebody I knew by reputation from a three-lettered institution north of mine, said, "Doug, I don't get it. Everything you've shown here today, I can do on my ASR 33.
That's a teletype.
That's a teletype, a physical teletype, not even a glass teletype. And in a Turing sense, he was right. You could. But that was completely not the point. And it just whiffed right over his
But that
head.
was not an unusual attitude.
And I thought to myself,
That was the standard attitude.
if the best and the brightest can't grok this, what hope have we got? It took a long time for this stuff to get into the mainstream, and assure yourselves, not all of it is in the mainstream at this point. Look at this multimedia teleconferencing collaborative stuff that you saw go smooth as silk, despite the breaths that were being held collectively, I'm sure. We can't do that today. So we got a ways to go to get back to the future, as I said earlier.
So I think we could take a few questions from the audience. You're going to have to speak up, though, because it's a little hard to hear, and I would ask the panel members to please repeat the questions. Yes?
I wanted to ask about the first part of that 1962 essay, which is abstract, but lays out the vision in a way that I think we need to catch up to understand why we haven't gotten there yet. So could you talk about what it was like to work with Doug Engelbart, who had the vision of the integrated domain of punches, cut and try, and these powerful electronic devices working together?
Yeah.
Repeat the question? Or?
Good luck, Jeff. I was translating it into what I wanted to answer while he was asking the question.
Multitask.
Yeah, I take it. What was it like to work with Doug that wanted this massive integrated environment? And I wanted to actually take it a little deeper than that. One of the ideas that Doug has is about coevolution, as he talks about it. And the idea of coevolution is that we evolve gadgets in the world. We invent things, and then we invent better things, and da-da-da. And as we put those things out into use, then the world adapts to them, and we actually have a lot of human systems and ways that we use them and ways that we communicate with them, and we change those things. And one of Doug's ideas was that we should actually experiment with both sides of that simultaneously. That it's not a matter of getting market input, inventing a gadget, throwing it out, seeing what happens, but that we should have experiments where we make a system a certain way, and then we actually change the way that we write or document or interact in some way, and see if we can get those changes to amplify each other and come up with better and better things. And outside of the experiences out of the Augmentation Research Center, I don't think that's been done
In that systematic a fashion.
in a systematic fashion, where you're actually doing the experiments, and then you're willing to throw it all away and change and do something else tomorrow.
Well, in fact, I'll give you an example. I remember going to an ATM in the early days when ATMs were just coming out, and there was a very well-dressed woman ahead of me who was swearing a blue streak at the ATM machine. And I couldn't figure out what was going on, so I actually leaned over her shoulder. She had asked for $35.23. And nowadays, she would know better than to ask for $35.23. So we do adapt to these things, no matter how badly designed they are. So, and by the way, we've all adapted to our personal computers too, right? We really have, with our mice and so on.
So part of the answer to the question is that Doug really did push on this coevolution aspect to it, and I wish we would do more in the world.
Yeah, let's take another one. Yes.
So it seems to me that the key characteristic of what Doug foresaw was that you need to make structure manifest and malleable. And in the last 40 years, we've been building computer systems that treat structure as the least malleable part of content and behavior and the other aspects of systems. And so we're building the wrong tools.
Right.
Because if you look at an end user who now is existing in a world of millions of control points
Yep.
and a sea full of information, it's the adaptation of all of that to me and how I want to deal with the world that we're missing.
Yeah, very much so. I think one of the ideas was that if the author reveals the structure, then you can do a lot to help not just the author, but other people get the structure back and use the structure. So, yeah.
On the other hand, though, I think perhaps one of the difficulties is that many people are actually not that comfortable with structure, either with dealing with it or with facilities for changing it and so on. It was always interesting to watch people trying to edit Lisp programs. Some of them really understood the structure and used the structural editing features, and others wanted to select that piece of text and move it there, parentheses and all, and they'd fix up the structure later. So some people had a structural image of what they were trying to achieve, and others simply didn't. It was literally a surface effect. And I think especially when you're dealing with text and documents and so forth, I think that both interpretations are useful, and perhaps no one is prepared to, I don't know, I mean, mine is not primarily the structural one. I will go back and add structure later if I need it. I like to work more on the surface stuff, but other people may work other ways. And perhaps that was one of the issues that NLS surfaced. Andy, were you going to make a comment?
Yeah, exactly that. The one thing that I thought was driven too deeply was the hierarchical outline structure and the limits on statements, and Ted Nelson convinced me very early on that we should have arbitrary length strings. So we superimposed in our system, the second one that he didn't participate in, the outline structure on top of arbitrary length strings, and some people never used it, and other people used it fanatically. And I learned from that, the Gardner lesson of multiple intelligences and seeing things in different ways, and you want to give choices. The problem is we don't have very many choices with today's systems.
Yeah. I see we have a microphone circulating now, so this helps at least. We don't have to repeat the questions.
Well, I was wanting to say huzzah for Dr. Van Dam's plea to go back to the future, and I wanted to know how far back, because part of the distance we need to go is back to the original sense of copyright. Copyright, it strikes me that the environment in which y'all were working was one that was not quite as repressive in terms of ownership. There was much more of an open source, even like the free software people are saying, so that people could really work together instead of worrying about, oh, who's going to get this? Who's going to get this to market before we do? It's, thank God there was no market for this in a way. But you built it and the market came, huh? Copyright is the question.
Software patents, too.
Well, yeah, so we were totally unaware of any of that.
Oh, it's publicly funded.
Yeah, and enormous sharing. I mean, everybody that was especially funded out of the ARPA programs at the time, and anybody in academia was completely open about everything that they were doing.
Well, and recall, this was before Bayh-Dole, so public money meant public ownership, and that actually made a lot of this easier.
On the other hand, sharing was not easy because not all of us had SDS 940s.
Correct.
That's right. That's right.
And,
But-
and in fact, just communicating the material around wasn't all that easy.
No.
Bob Taylor, who's going to be on the program, instituted a very special thing that I got to participate in. I think he felt that the principal investigators weren't communicating well enough between MIT and Stanford and various places. And so he had graduate student conferences I got to go to 2 of those, and they were quite wonderful because the graduate students would come and we all knew what each other were doing.
Right.
Just for some sense of context and history, what else was demoed at this conference that the mother beat up?
He gave a paper. He'll tell you.
So, well, the reason I was at the fall joint, I had just come to Stanford as a graduate student, and I had a paper co-authored with Ivan Sutherland at the conference about a clipping divider, which is some hardware we'd built in the preceding years. And I was at Doug's demo purely by accident because I was there to give a paper. Actually, Ivan gave the paper, full disclosure. He trusted me to help write it, but not to give it. I shouldn't say it. He was an incredibly generous teacher, but he gave the paper.
And I was there to run a panel on graphics data structures.
So I must say that, the notion of interactive displays that you saw here today, I mean, Andy and I certainly both saw that a lot at that time. That was not a new thing, but trying to do it in a time-sharing environment and trying to do it with this kind of application and with the capabilities and functionality of the application were unique.
Just to give you an idea of what the times were like, we lived and died by the allocation of virtual money, or funny money, on the mainframe, and at one point I got into a raging fight with the VP who was in charge of allocating that, because he had learned that I was using the graphics system and the slice of the computer to do things for humanities professors with this wonderful text and hypertext system. And he said, let them use typewriters. Literally, it's the most literal mapping of let them eat cake that I've ever heard. And he meant it.
I think it would be interesting, though, to know who was in the audience and where those ideas went out. I know one of the people was Alan Kay, who you may have heard of. Alan went on from that to Xerox PARC and got Smalltalk started and really pushed a lot of these ideas tremendously out into the world. So I think a lot of people were profoundly, in the audience that day, were profoundly impacted by it and then went out and really said, okay, how can I do this?
I'm curious about one of the aspects that you said was the deeper material that wasn't really covered in the actual demo, and that is the way in which you work together and the way in which the tools affect people over time as they work together. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that aspect of this original team. And did the tools improve your teamwork? And what was the relationship between tools and people?
You wanted to say something?
Again, for me, it was a revelation to learn about this bootstrap community. Up till that time, I thought more of the hypertext workstation as something with which you did your own knowledge work. And I instantly got it. And so in the next several years, mounted several experiments with courses and students and faculty. And I believe we were the first people to have online scholarly communities as opposed to technical communities in the early 70s, some of which we even published. And so we take for granted the idea of communities of practice and affinity groups and so on. But at the time, that just didn't exist. You had ARPA contractors who had some shared ideas. But the idea of putting everybody online with the same materials and commenting on each other's work and enriching the corpus day by day and hour by hour, that was new. And it worked like a charm in the academic environment, as you can well imagine.
Any other comments?
I think you were part of being immersed in a group where everybody was using the same tools and using them on a day-to-day basis, and the people who were developing the tools were sitting next to the people who were using the tools, and were using the tools. That was sort of a really tight loop that led to very rapid progress. And you changed as...
Well, plus I wasn't there, but PARC had some of these similar properties
Very much
when
so.
I was there. And there is a satisfaction in building a tool for somebody down the hall, and especially when they come and thank you for it. They don't often, but you get the message. No, you really do.
We do.
And
Absolutely.
You use their tools too, and it's a mutual responsibility that develops, and self-reliance. I mean, the team was dependent only on the team.
And that's something that's missing now.
Well, it's missing
harder,
maybe. It's harder now, right. But both of the scope of the project and what was available and how it was done, I think gave rise to, I mean, that's a kind of bootstrapping of itself in a way, which is the team becomes self-reliant. And I think that's a multiplier effect that we don't always have in research projects. Sir.
Speaking of a collective intelligence and using computers to bootstrap democracy, I would like to pose the question with all the computer experts here in this hall: how can we wrest control of the voting system back from the proprietary vendors and put it in the place where it should be, in the hands of the public and the government? Either is it open source, or how do we ensure that we're going to get that we can use the technology to improve our voting, electoral systems, and still have a legitimate vote count? I believe that a paper ballot is the end result, but how can we get it out of the hands of the vendors right now?
So I would kind of like to rule that a problem for our time rather than for what we were trying to address 40 years ago. But you may have noticed John Markoff will be on the program in the second half. He wrote a column in last week's Times about how the thieves have got the internet. You might ask him that question. He may have some good ideas. I think in a lot of these cases, there are plenty of technologies available. It comes back to the problem I think that Jeff was talking about. We have to co-evolve our ability to actually use them intelligently at scale. I mean, there are a lot of things like security. Perhaps voting is another example where if one could make a concerted, huge effort to change the way the majority of people do something, it doesn't matter as much what you change to as that everybody agrees and moves forward. And that's the part that I think we have difficulty with. We no longer have the luxury of being able to start small and grow up in the technology arena that, for example, this demo led to. Because now, if you want to change something, you have to pretty much change it at scale. It's not entirely true. There's still ways to launch new things that are very different. But for the kind of problem that you're talking about, it's very hard for a small community or a small vendor to go off and do something very different that will make a huge difference, that will then get adopted widely by everyone. The marketplace is not good at solving those kinds of problems.
Well, fortunately, I happen to have part of the answer to that. I'm Edward Cherlin. I'm a founding member of the Open Voting Consortium. We have a functioning open source voting system.
Was this read up?
which was demonstrated at Linux World Expo last summer. And we had 800 people come and try out our system in simulated voting booths. And anybody who wants to know more can talk to us and to the other people involved in proposing systems in the same space. The California Secretary of State is evaluating them now. Barack Obama has asked us to discuss the human rights issues and every other campaign issue and governance issues, so we have a bit of collective intelligence in government again. But the question I actually wanted to ask is, what did Doug say that you still don't understand?
I don't remember. That's the problem.
Well, there's one thing that I think Doug has visions in his head that I still don't understand. And I can sort of talk about it, but the idea is that when your media is in digital form, you can really break out of the way that you used to represent things. So, text reading left to right and top to bottom in a strictly linear way is what we've been doing for a few thousand years, but it's not clear that we think that way. And so why do we have our computers doing text that way? Well, that's why we learned to do it that way, but maybe there are other ways of writing that...
We're doing all the others. We're doing right to left, top to bottom.
No, but maybe sentences shouldn't be sentences, and they should spiral in different ways, and we should have different syntax, and there's nothing natural about natural language in a sense. So, and I've had conversations with Doug, and I think he had ideas in the back of his head, and I still don't get them very well.
Let's go, we have a question over here.
Yeah, I'm Bruce Damer. I'm a vintage computer collector from Digibarn Computer Museum. We just got, last year, a team of us got a Link working, Lincoln Laboratory, Link, Washington, Wes Clark's machine. I was wondering what influence those sort of early to mid-60s machines had on NLS. And the second part of the question is, what happened to the NLS hardware? We know the mouse and maybe key set are still here, but what happened to the hardware?
Anybody know?
The actual they mean the time-sharing machines?
Where's the mouse?
Oh, the mouse is, the SRI has tracked the mice down.
Pardon me?
SRI knows where the mice are.
Did one make it to the Smithsonian? They had a picture in there recently.
Yeah, they had some replicas made. Don Nielsen should answer that one, actually.
I think you had a contract that shipped it down to Arizona State or something like that and disappeared.
Yeah,
Hardware
The big hardware.
The hardware disappeared in Arizona.
One thing I'd like to ask, as long as I got the microphone, Doug went to a ARPA project manager leaders meeting and was asked about this. I'm talking about networking now, and I know that wasn't part of the demonstration per se, but on the other hand, for over 2 decades, if you wanted to get on the ARPANET or the internet, you came through Doug's group. And if any of you are familiar, were there that time, I sort of had the notion that everybody else stood one step back when they asked for volunteers to run the Network Information Center. But that turned out to be an absolutely pivotal point, you know, in the emerging of what we think of today as you know, common networking. Any of you familiar with that?
I'm not sure what the question is. You're talking about the Network Information Center? You're talking about the Network Information Center?
It became that.
Yeah, that name seems slightly ahead of its time in the demo.
Yes, it was. The ARPANET really, it was in the diagram and mentioned, but it was not connected until 69.
It was December of 69 that the first packets flowed on
a year and a half later. And as I mentioned earlier, we basically had identifiers for everybody in the system. And the concept then was to expand that sense of identifying individuals who contributed to the work or were knowledge workers involved with the system, to expand it to those who use the ARPANET. And the Network Information Center was the facility for doing that. And we eventually hired Jake Feindler to manage that whole process. So people who wanted to get into the system went through Jake and got an identifier which would be registered with our system and also on the WHOIS database.
I believe it was primarily paper at that time.
Initially, yes.
A large library of paper.
I don't know when the WHOIS capability came up on the ARPANET, but it eventually existed as a live database.
Okay, let's take one last question.
So we've seen what a 1968 demo looks like, and if we were to see a 2009 demo, what would be the highlights and some key points in it?
I missed that.
What would a 2009 version of the demo look like?
Oh, dear.
I have a suggestion. Laptop for Child EXO. Collaborative software.
For those of you who didn't hear, the suggestion is one laptop per child, basically.
Well, so I think one of the points being...
Collaborative software.
Ah, the collaborative software. I see what you, yes.
Right.
Much closer to Doug's idea of all-inclusive.
As Alan Kay says, the closest thing ever to a dynamo.
So I think the generic answer is you'll find that there are a number of systems that it's in the 40 years since then that have come closer and closer to many of these ideas. But as you heard from many people, and we'll probably hear again later today, there's not the integrated knock your socks off tool that this demonstration suggested. And that also suggests that there's plenty of room for additional work, whether it's along Doug's vision lines or others, that give us better tools. Computers are great tools for us. They could be greater tools. So why don't we stop there, thank the panel, and we'll take a half-hour break and reconvene at 3:20, which is the published time in your program, to hear John Markoff and Bob Taylor, a sure-to-be entertaining duo. Thank you.